right, good morning, everybody. Good to see such a good turnout again this year. So just to get started a little bit, the session this morning is going to be primarily on kind of the, I'll say, the old information, so kind of the requirements that have been out there for several years. And then this afternoon we'll talk about probably what everybody's most interested in, LB 644 and all those state requirements, changes, and everything that goes along with that. So just to start out with, I know a lot of you hopefully are kind of getting to know me a little bit better and others in our office. Previously, obviously, Deanne worked with everybody. She had a good relationship with everybody. So I just want to take a little bit of time to talk about the rest of us that are still around. So myself, I've been with the office since 2013. So coming up on 10 years, it seems like 1 year, but coming up quick on 10 years. And then we also have about 45 other auditors in our office, do a lot of different things. Myself, primarily, my focus is on budgets, obviously, which is why I'm here. And then also I do a lot of accounting. So just a little bit about me. Again, if there was anything that you used to talk to Deanne about, you can still contact me. Probably taking over the majority of Deanne's responsibility. So don't be afraid to reach out to us. We're happy to help as much as we can. The agenda for today, a little bit, hopefully, we probably have, for those of you that were here last year, probably have a little overlap, but I tried to hopefully get some new information out there, so we don't just repeat exactly what we talked about last year. But agenda for today, start out with Rolla County Board officials, Rolla County Board as it relates to other governments, other subdivisions in the county, the role of our office in the budget process, go over the budget formula, cash reserves, taxing authority, levy limit, and then budget amendments. So to start out with, anytime I talk to counties specifically about budgets, I always start off by reminding everybody that you guys are in that not only do you have to follow the Nebraska Budget Act that everybody else also has to follow, but you guys are lucky, and you also have the County Budget Act statutes that you get to follow. So that's primarily what we're going to be talking about today, is those County Budget Act statutes, those requirements that are specific to county. So I just always remind everybody, if you're involved with other governments, other subdivisions, the reason why your budget looks different and why your budget is probably about this thick versus others are about this thick is because of those County Budget Act statutes. So we'll go over that this morning. To start with 23906, that is a statute that outlines that the Finance Committee of the County Board is the budget making authority. So the statutes default to the Finance Committee. If your county,
yeah. You want to check your space, your slides aren't moving on the, are they? Sure, sorry. Sorry. They're changing now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so Finance Committee, the County Board is the default budget making authority. If your county doesn't have a Finance Committee, maybe you only have a 3-commissioner board and you don't have a separate Finance Committee, then it would be your full budget making authority. The County Board can designate somebody else to be the budget making authority. So if the Finance Committee doesn't want to do the budget, they want to have somebody else work on the budget, they can designate somebody else to be that budget making authority, whether it's the county clerk, whether it's the county sheriff, whether it's a local CPA, anybody that the county board designates can also be the budget making authority. That budget making authority, whoever that is, needs to have kind of a rough draft of the budget to the county board by August 1st. So by August 1st, the budget making authority would have kind of put together the budget, taken all the officials' requests, put them into the forms, and had a rough draft of the budget to present to the county board by August 1st. So kind of that August 1st date is really the first key date in the budget process. And then 23906 also is a statute that outlines a summary of the proposed budget would need to be published 4 days prior to the budget hearing. A few more statutes here. 23908, that would be the statute that outlines that after the kind of rough draft of the budget is prepared by the budget making authority, it goes to the full county board to review. And then once it goes to the full county board, they can make changes. If they don't like something in there, they want to increase the budget, decrease the budget, make any changes, they can do that. But if it affects the budget of any of the officials or any of the offices in the county board would need to have a hearing with that office. So if the county board wants to cut the county treasurer's budget by $25,000, the county board can do that. They would have that authority, but they would first have to hold a hearing with, in this case, in this example, the county treasurer. Basically, they give the treasurer an opportunity to make their case. Say, you can't cut my budget, I need new computers, or I have new requirements that I have to follow, that kind of stuff. So you have to have a hearing. After the hearing, the county board could say, okay, great, you made a good case, but we don't care. We want to decrease the levy, and we're still paying you $25,000. That will be within the county board's authority, as long as they have that hearing. 23909, that's the statute that has the deadline for the county budget to be completed and submitted. So you can see there it's starting this year, September 30th. So those of you that have been around for a while probably remember previously that date was September 20th. But starting this year as a result of Levy 644, one of the changes that bill made was to push the due date back 10 days to September 30th. So we have all these new requirements we're going to talk about later this afternoon. And as a result of that, they decided to push it back 10 days to September 30th. So that'll be a change for this year. 23913, that statute outlines that the budget document needs to outline the changes that were made by the county board during the review, revision, and adoption of the budget. So for those of you that are seen the forms before, familiar with the forms, there's those 3 columns that have officials request, proposed, and then final adopted budget. That's why there's those 3 columns. So that way we can say, here's where we started from, here's the changes that were made by the county board, and then here's the final number. So that way, kind of everything's outlined in the budget. If somebody wants to see what changes the county board made, they can see that by basically looking at here's where we started from in that first column and comparing to the actual final adopted budget in the last column. A couple of things here regarding the role of the county board and other county officials in the county. So just kind of a reminder, I know everybody already does this, I'm sure, but everybody in the county has a role in the budget process. So county board kind of has the final authority, but all these other offices really need to be thinking about the budget as well because it affects their office. So just kind of a reminder to be thinking about what your budget needs are for the upcoming years throughout the year. So if you know you have old computers that you need to replace, make sure you remember that when you come to kind of this time of the year and start putting together your budget request. If you have new, kind of go back to a couple of years ago, the treasurers had to implement Victory. If you had additional costs that were related to that implementation of the new system, obviously you would want to make sure you're thinking about that so you can put that in your budget request. So just kind of be aware of that throughout the year. The other thing to keep in mind is legislative changes. The one that comes to mind this year is LB 644. So again, we'll talk about it this afternoon, but part of LB 644 says that the cost of the postcards can be billed back to the participating subdivisions. So when you do your budget, you're going to have extra costs for printing and mailing these postcards. So you want to make sure you account for that in your budget this fall. But you also want to remember the revenue side. So we have costs of mailing done yet, but some of those are gonna be reimbursed by the subdivision. So, that's just kind of an example of the changes or things that you want to be aware of when you're kind of crafting the budget each year. Again, probably right now, May, June timeframe is really when everybody's probably getting really started filling out those official requests. But again, think about it throughout the year. So when it comes to this time, you have a good idea, you can do a really good estimate budget, and kind of set yourself up for success for the next year. Let's see, a few more statutes here. 23-916. This would be the statute that outlines kind of the basically the level of budgetary control. And that statute says that no officer, department, agency can exceed their adopted budget. For counties, each official or each office would be tied to their budget. So if the county clerk's budget is 200,000, county clerk is limited to 200,000. If the county treasurer's 250,000, county treasurer is limited to 250,000. Road department, any of the offices, it would be set basically by each office. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's a statute that outlines those budget limits. And then 23-919, that's kind of the penalty statute. So if anybody in the county goes over budget, statutes say that you'd be guilty of a class 4 misdemeanor, and you would also be subject to removal from office. So I don't know if anybody here really wants to be removed. I would imagine hopefully not. So really important that we monitoring that budget, make sure if you're going to be going over budget. This year especially, and costs are going out of control. If you are going to go over budget, make sure you're going to the county board and amending the budget. But if you do go over budget and there aren't any amendments completed before the end of the fiscal year, technically the statutes say that you could be removed from office. Okay, a little bit more about level budgetary control. We'll start with the general fund because the general fund's a little bit different. So for the general fund, as you all know, we have multiple offices operating out of the general fund. So within the general fund, we have a budget for the clerk, we have a budget for the county board, we have a budget for all the other officials, departments that operate out of the general fund. So the level of budgetary control for the general fund would be what I would say the function level, or you could also think of it as the office level. So like we talked about earlier, each office is held to their total budget. So clerk's office is held to the clerk's office total budget. It's on a line item budget, so if salaries go over budget, that's fine, as long as somewhere else within the clerk's budget with that line item be under budget. So really, once the budget for each office is set, it becomes up to that official or that department head or whoever to decide how they want to use that budget. So just because a specific line item is in the budget for a specific amount, each official would have the authority to spend the money on what they want in their office. Within the general fund, county board has the authority to reallocate budget authority. So if the county clerk's budget is going to go over, but we have extra budget authority in the general miscellaneous function, county board can pass a resolution saying we're going to subtract 20,000 from the general miscellaneous and into our within the county board's authority.
You're good. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going.
Good. Okay. So again, general fund, just to reiterate. County board has authority to reallocate, basically move budget authority between offices or departments by resolution. And and that would not require any amendment or yes.
Do I dare say that you tried?
Hopefully we're good. So let's see, hopefully general fund, just again, hopefully the last time here, can reallocate budget within the general fund, move budget authority around by resolution of the county board, and that would not require a formal amendment or a hearing or anything like that. If you would need to increase the total budget of the general fund, so if somebody's going over budget, then you can't cover that by taking it away from somebody else. That's what would trigger the formal budget amendment, having to have a hearing, publish notice in the newspaper, and re-adopt that amendment. So that's kind of unique to the general fund. For all your other funds, so your road fund, inheritance fund, all those other funds, since we don't have multiple offices or multiple budgets within that other fund, the level of budgetary control would be at the fund level. So if the road fund budget in total is $2 million, then that's the budget for that fund. Since we don't have multiple budgets within the road fund, for example, we wouldn't have the option of moving money around or reallocating between budgets. So if the road fund budget is $2 million and costs are going out of control and we need to spend $2.5 million this year, you would have to go through the budget process. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but pretty much similar to what you do to originally adopt the budget, publish a notice, holding a hearing, and having we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Again, not a line item budget, so general fund would be by each office or each department. All those other funds would be the total for that fund. A couple of things here with budget hearings. I know we've talked about these budget hearings a lot the last couple of years, from LE 148, all those new changes that came through a couple of years ago, so I won't spend too much time on budget hearings, but just a couple reminders here. So the primary statute that outlines the requirements of the budget hearing would be 13506. So if you have any questions or any concerns or anything like that, you want to refer to 13506. That statute outlines that the budget hearing must be held separately from the regular scheduled meeting. So no longer can you have the budget hearing within a regular board meeting. It have to be held separate. And again, the purpose of the budget hearing is to get input from the taxpayers. So I know several of you are probably sitting out there thinking that I've been on the board or I've been working for the county for 20 years and nobody ever shows up to the budget. I get that. I'm sure that's true, but technically, according to the statutes, the purpose of the budget hearing is to give an opportunity for the taxpayers to voice their opinions. So that's the goal of the budget hearing. And then after you get that input from the taxpayers, the county board would take that into consideration and then go back and finalize the budget. So if there were a bunch of people that came to the county and said, maybe you guys aren't spending enough on roads in the county. We want you to spend more money on roads in the county. I don't know if that would ever happen, but theoretically speaking, then the county board would take that into consideration. Maybe they put more money in the budget for roads, maybe they don't. But the purpose of the budget hearing is to get that input. So I know in practice, a lot of people have a budget hearing and then adopt the budget the same day. I think probably because again, nobody ever shows up, so the thought is probably, well, why am I gonna have multiple meetings when I don't need to? I can have a budget hearing and I can adopt it all on the same day. That's fine. There's nothing that says you can't do that. But really the goal of the budget hearing is to hold it, get the input, and then at a later date, finalize the budget and adopt the budget. So I think that's going to be extra important this fall, since we're going to have this joint public hearing that we're going to talk about. It might be a good idea. My recommendation would be to hold this budget hearing early on. So I know a lot of people hold it in September. You might want to think about holding it early on at the end of August. So that way it's kind of done, out of the way, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. It's something to keep in mind there. And then again, last thing, hold it as early as possible. So if you get it done and out of the way in August, then that piece is done and over with, and you don't have to worry about that anymore. Problems.
If you change the budget, so
Right. If the final budget that's adopted is different than what was originally published in the newspaper, in that case, as long as you publish a summary of changes in the newspaper within 20 days after the budget is adopted, you wouldn't have to go through the process again. So there is a 20-day provision to make the public aware of those changes without going through the whole process again. Okay, role of county board and other government. So not only does the county board have major role and major authority over the county budget, but the county board also has at least some authority over the budget of the other local governments in the county. So your smaller governments, your fire districts, townships, cemetery district, those guys that get their levy authority from the county, county board has at least a little bit of authority over their budgets as well. We're not talking about school districts. We are talking about ESUs, NRDs, any of those guys that have their own levy authority. Right now, we're specifically talking about those smaller governments that get their levy authority from the county. So the statutes outline that the county has a total of 50 cents of levy authority. And of that 50 cents, the county board could decide to allocate up to 15 cents of that authority to those other smaller governments. So the Ag Society, fire districts, etc. Again, those smaller governments get their taxing authority from the county board. So the only way an Ag Society, for example, would have authority to set a levy is if they get that authority from the county board as a piece of that 15 cents that the county board has to allocate out. If the county board says no, Ag Society, you don't get any of our 15 cents. County board could do that. And then at that point, the Ag Society or whoever else would be forced to go into the taxpayers, either in an election or town hall meeting to get levy authority. So you can see there, county board does have at least some control over these smaller governments. And in order to get a piece of that 15 cents, those smaller governments need to submit a resolution to the county board by August 1st each year. So if the township wants 5 cents, they want to be able to have a 5-cent levy. The township board needs to get a resolution passed and sent into the county board by August 1st each year. If they don't get that resolution sent in by August 1st and they don't ask for any levy authority, we'll talk about next here that the county board can deny it. So they don't ask for anything, county board doesn't have to give them anything. So let's see here. Authority allocated to other districts does count against the 50 cents of authority for the county. So in an example, if the county board decides to allocate out 10 cents to townships, 1 cent to Ag Society, and 4 cents to fire districts, in that example, they allocated out the full 15 cents, and that would mean there's only 35 cents left for the county. So the maximum levy the county could set is 35 cents. So those smaller subdivisions need to get their request in by August 1st, which again, that's the date that the county board should be getting the initial draft of the county budget. So on August 1st, not only do we have an idea of what the county budget's looking like, but we should also have an idea of what these other governments are like. And then we have 1 month to respond. So by September 1st, the county board needs to pass a resolution stating what authority they're actually giving to those local governments. So if the townships came in and asked for 5 cents, county board needs to respond to that by September 1st and say, yes, we'll give you the 5 cents. Or maybe the county board decides, well, we don't have 5 cents to give out. We need to keep it for ourselves. We have roads in the county that we need to fix. We have windows in the courthouse that need replaced. Whatever the case is, county board could decide that they only get 2 cents. That would be what's in the county board's authority. Or the county board could say 0. Townships, you don't get any of our levy authority. That would all be within the county board's decision. Regarding the decision of how much is allocated out to those local governments is all within the county board's authority. If they don't like the authority that is given to them by the county board, whether that's 0 or whether it's 2 cents and they want 5 cents, their options would be to go to the voters. Statute has 2 options there, either a town hall meeting. We'd have to get at least 10% of the registered voters in that district to show up to a town hall meeting, and they would vote on it at that meeting, and then you get levy authority through that route. Or the other option would be to go to an election. So at this point, obviously we decided on the primary. General's not until November. So if anybody wants to go to an election at this point, it would have to be a special election. One last thing there is if they do get if the Ag Society or Cemetery District or whoever does go to vote, either a town hall meeting or an election, and they get authority, if the taxpayers approve the levy, that whatever levy is approved would not count against the 50 cents of the county. So if the townships ask the county for 5 cents, county board says no, 0, and the township goes with voters and the voters approve 10-cent levy, township can have that 10-cent levy and it doesn't count against the county's 50 cents. Because no longer are they getting their authority from the county, they're getting it from the voters. Fire districts are a little bit different. A couple of years ago now, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, legislature decided to make some changes and said if certain criteria are met, fire districts have 10.5 cents of their own levy authority. So no longer would they have to get their authority from the county board. They would have 10.5 cents on their own. So similar to a school district that has their own levy authority, the school district doesn't have to go to the county board. Certain criteria are met that we'll talk about here in a second. Fire districts would have up to 10.5 cents. So the criteria would be if in the prior year the county levy was over 40 cents, and that would include not only the county's levy, but it would also include the authority that was allocated out to other subdivisions. So say the county's levy was 35 cents and you allocated out 10 cents to the Ag Society and townships and cemetery districts. That would put your total levy at 45 cents, which is over the 40 cents. The other option would be if the county board denies levy authority to the fire district. So if the fire districts come in and ask for a 5-cent levy, county board denies it, and that resolution that's passed by September 1st, the next year, the fire district would qualify for that 10.5 cent provision. So might be something to think about in your county if you're kind of running up against the 50-cent levy limit. This might be an option to get those fire districts outside of your levy authority. That way, county would have extra room in their budget, and fire districts could have up to 10.5 cents of their own authority, which I would imagine is probably more than they're getting from the county. That's an option there. If the fire district does qualify for that 10.5 cent provision, That would not count against the county's 50 cents. So like I talked about, if they're levying taxes under this authority, no longer does it count against the 50 cents. They're similar to all the other entities that have a home levy authority that are kind of off on their own. Yeah.
What if you're in an MFO?
MFOs make it a little bit trickier. They would potentially have up to 10.5 cents of authority. They would still have to make sure they're meeting the limits or the maximum levies in that MFO agreement. So, as an example, say that MFO levy is 3.5 cents. County board denies it. That would mean they qualify for this authority, and then so they could still set that 3.5 cents, but they're setting it under this authority versus the county's authority. I know I'm saying authority a lot here, but so you still have to consider the MFO. That's another piece in the fact. Couple of reminders here on setting levies. Primary statute here regarding levy setting is 77-1601. So if any questions come up, that's a statute we want to refer to for levy setting. A reminder that the county should only be setting levies for subdivisions that submit a budget. So those of you that have been around for a while might remember that several years ago, the statutes used to say that the levy for the current year is the same levy as the prior year, unless they pass a resolution changing it. So no longer is that language in there. That was removed a couple of years ago now. So every year, if they want to levy, all the subdivisions in the county need to be completing a budget and submitting it to the county. So if you don't get a budget, no levy. Couple of things here. The county's calculating levies. Just make sure you have good procedures in place to make sure that those levies are being calculated correctly. So we don't want to have a transposition error or whatever happens and shoot the budget that was submitted to us said the school district wants a $1.05, but we had an error, a math error, transposition error, whatever the case, and whoops, the levy was set is only 95 cents. That's not a good thing. So just make sure we have good review procedures in your county to make sure that those levies that you're setting are correct based on the budgets that are submitted. So maybe the county clerk calculates a levy, and somebody else in the clerk's office also calculates levy, and we do a comparison between the two. Or maybe somebody calculates it and another person reviews it. County board, hopefully when you're setting levies in October, hopefully you're doing something to make sure that those levies are accurate too, because it's ultimately the county board that's setting those levies. Yeah, you're relying on other people in the county, I'm sure, to calculate and get those levies to you, but you guys are the ones setting it. So want to make sure that those levies are set correctly. Every year, myself, previously Deanne, we get phone calls from usually at least a few counties that they say, what do we do? We realize we set a levy wrong. What do we do? What do we do? And you can tell they aren't having a good day. If they're calling me and saying we set a levy wrong, they're not having a good day. So avoid that at all possible by making sure you have good procedures in place to make sure that those levies are set correctly from the get-go. I would also recommend that after the levies are set by the county board in October, that those are sent out to all the subdivisions in your county to review. So by October 15th or October 20th now this year, once the county board passes that resolution setting final levies, those get sent out to the school district, the ESU, fire, township, everybody in your county that has a levy, so they can review it, and that way it's kind of on them a little bit too. So if you said a levy wrong and you sent it out to them and they didn't say anything about it, but come December when they get their tax statement in the mail, they call you and say, hey, you said our levy wrong. Well, in that case, if you do this, you could say, well, I sent these out to you in October and you didn't say anything. So just something to think of there. You might also want to think about requiring them to respond to you. So not only do you send the levies out to them, but you say, hey, you guys need to respond to me and say, yes, we agree with our levy. There's not anything in statute that would require that, so they could decide not to respond to you, and you really won't have any authority to say you have to respond, but I guess it never hurts to ask. So just a couple things to think about there. November 5th, that would be the last day to correct any incorrect levy. So if we do set a levy wrong and catch it before November 5th, we can correct it. But after that November 5th date, really there's not much that can be done. I will say that in the past, if the levy is incorrect as a result of an error by the county, there have been counties that I know of that have made the decision that maybe it's November 15th and we don't catch it until November 15th, but we messed up. It's our fault. There have been counties that have decided, well, the risk of somebody suing us because of an incorrect levy is greater than the risk of somebody suing us because we changed the levy after November 5th. They made the decision to just go ahead and fix it. So I can't say that's fine because that's not outlined in the statutes, but I'll say that that's been done before and that's a decision that's been made by counties. So again, I can't say it's fine, but something to consider in your county. Our office is rolling the budget process. So the statutes have quite a few requirements for not only counties, but also for our office. And it outlines that we prescribe the budget forms. So that's why everybody has to go out to our website and get the forms and download them every year. That puts that duty on our office. It also outlines that the state auditor may review the budget forms for errors, non-compliance with the Budget Act. You can see there it says may, so technically we would not have to review all the budget forms, but I can tell you that we do. So all 2,500 or so budgets that are submitted to our office, not only counties, but everybody else in the state, we do perform a review of all the budgets. And then 13504 also requires that if we do detect errors in the budget, that those are correct. So if you get a phone call from us or an email from us saying, hey, we noted whatever the case is in your budget, you need to fix it, there would be a statute out there that requires it. So again, this last year, there were 2,431 budgets that were filed with our office. Typically, it stays right around that 2,400 to 2,500 mark every year. So you can see it's a big project for us as well. I know it's a lot of work for you guys and a lot of work for us too to process those 2,400 budgets and review those as well. This slide here, important budget statutes. This one I really just included to kind of put all those statute references in one place. So a lot of times, a lot of phone calls we get in our office would be from counties or other governments or attorneys asking about, hey, where do I find information, or where's the statute on levy limits, or where's the requirements for county budgets, or where's the statutes regarding the lid. And unfortunately, you can see they're not all in one place. So it would be really nice if we could go to one section of the statutes and have everything related to budgets in one spot, but that's not how it's worked out over the years. You can see there we have the Nebraska Budget Act in Chapter 13, Article 5. So that would be the one applicable to everybody, including counties. The budget limits, so that would be the lid on restricted funds that we're going to talk about a little bit more later on. That would be in 13.518 to 13.522. Specific County Budget Act, Chapter 23, Article 9. Levy setting, Property Tax Request Act, and levy limits are all in Chapter 77. So just kind of want to put those in there for reference, future reference, if anybody has questions on where to find the statutes. Budget formula. So everybody in this room that works on the budget is aware of this budget formula, whether you realize it or not. By filling out the forms, the way they're set up, you're following this budget formula. But I kind of wanted to just walk through how it works, how the forms are set up, and kind of why it is the way it is. So the budget formula is necessary cash reserve plus budgeted disbursements equals your total requirements. So basically, how much money do we need to have on hand at the end of the year, plus how much we need to spend during the year equals how much money we need to operate our county and have a cash reserve, total requirements. The next one would be our beginning fund balance, plus our budgeted receipts other than property taxes, plus property taxes equals our total resources available. So basically, how much money did we start with during the year? How much money are we going to get in from other sources besides property taxes? And property taxes equals how much money we have available to work with. And in order to present a balanced budget, we need to make sure that our total requirements, so how much money we need, equals our total resources available. So in other words, the amount of money you need must equal the amount of money you have available. So that's the quick version of the budget formula. And the key thing I wanted to talk about is basically the property tax number would become a plug in order to balance the budget. So our necessary cash reserve, we're going to estimate that. We're going to decide, hey, our county needs to have a cash reserve of $250,000. So we'll know that number. We'll go through and we'll figure out how much money we need to spend during the year. We'll take all those offices' requests, put everything together and figure out here's what we need to spend next year. Beginning fund balance, we know that's whatever we ended last year with. So whatever the treasurer said we had in our funds at June 30 of the prior year, that's what we're going to start the next budget year with. We're going to go through and we're going to budget receipts other than property taxes. So we're going to estimate how much money are we expecting to get from the state for highway allocation or grant money or other revenue sources besides property taxes. We're going to estimate that number. And then in order to balance the budget, we're going to have whatever property tax is needed to balance. So have an example here. So just a really simple example, we're going to say our fund balance at the end of the prior year was $1 million. We had $1 million in our general fund. And we're going to go through and we're going to budget revenue other than property tax. We're going to say, well, we know we're going to get highway allocation. Well, I guess that one can get a good example for the general fund. We know we're going to get insurance tax from the state, and we know we're going to get motor vehicle tax, and we know we're going to get grants. And so we're going to go through and we're going to budget all of those non-property tax numbers. And in this example, we're going to say that's $5 million. So we started the year with $1 million. We're budgeting that we're going to get an extra another $5 million from other sources. So we have at this point total resources of $6 million. And then we're going to go through and we're going to look at our disbursements, and we're going to say this county they need to spend $8 million. We need to have authority to spend $8 million out of our general fund. And we want to have 25% cash reserve, so we need $2 million cash reserve, which would equal total requirements of $10 million. So right now we have resources or total money available of $6 million, but we need $10 million. Well, in order to balance the budget, that would mean we would need to have a property tax request of $4 million. That's kind of an example to walk through that budget formula. A lot of times the budget discussions focus on the disbursement side. So a lot of times we're thinking, hey, I want to raise, my people want raises. We need to buy new equipment, and here's how much money we need to spend, and that's definitely an important piece of the budget. But that revenue side is also an important piece. So we don't want to just focus on the disbursement side and just kind of plug whatever numbers into the revenue side. Because if those budgeted receipts are too high or too low, that could result in a property tax request that's too high or too low. So a couple more examples here. Let's say our budgeted receipts other than property taxes is $2 million. And our cash reserve is $1 million. Well, if our actual receipts other than property taxes end up coming in at $1.5 million, or $500,000 less than we originally budgeted, that would basically result in that $1 million cash reserve we originally wanted being reduced down to $500,000. Other way, let's say instead of the $2 million we originally thought we were going to get, we actually end up getting $2.5 million. We get an extra $500,000. in that case, we could have reduced our property tax request by $500,000. But because our budgeted receipts other than property taxes wasn't the best, we taxed more than we needed to. So that's kind of an example to walk through the impact. So if you're going to get a grant for $50,000, you want to make sure that you're putting that $50,000 grant revenue in the budget to offset the hopefully probably $50,000 you're going to spend. Because if you have $50,000 that you're going to budget to spend on a grant, for example, but you don't put that $50,000 grant revenue in there, by default, you're basically making your tax request increase to cover that. So I know we're talking about a little bit of math there. Hopefully that makes sense. But a couple of reminders here. Homestead exemption and property tax credits. So you don't want to be budgeting to receive that money separate from your property tax request. So those of you that use our forms, you see that those boxes are X'd out or blacked out. And the reason for that is because that homestead and that tax credit is not going to be received in addition to the property tax request. It's just a piece of your property tax request is going to be paid for by the state rather than the local taxpayers. So if your budget says we need $1 million, you aren't going to get $1 million from your local taxpayers plus another 100,000 from the state. You're just going to get maybe 900,000 from the local taxpayers. And then the remaining 100,000 is going to be made up by the state from homestead or property tax credit. So that's a common thing we see is people budget to receive that homestead and tax credit in addition to their property tax request. I just want to make sure everybody realizes that. Let's say you have a budget and it has 200,000 in there for homestead. You're not going to get an extra 200,000. I can tell you right now. You're not going to get an extra 200,000. You're just going to get whatever that property tax request is. Cash reserves. So key thing here with cash reserves is that the budget does not equal money in the bank. So I see a few treasurers here. The treasurer has the money. So whatever the treasurer's fund balances say, that's how much money the county has. That's what's available. Just like your personal checking account, if you have $2,000 in your checking account, that's how much money you have to spend. Counties, whatever the treasurer says is in the fund balances, that's what you have to spend. Even though the budget might say you have more to spend. Maybe the budget says, right now, May, we're getting close to the end of the year. Maybe the budget says we still have $1 million to spend in our road fund. Well, our highway department saying, great, we got $1 million. Let's get this money spent. But go over to the treasurer's office, the treasurer says, well, road fund only has $200,000. Well, 200,000 is a lot less than $1 million. So unless you get more money into that road fund to equal $1 million, you can't spend $1 million. Either you have to transfer money in from general fund or inheritance fund, or maybe you're going to get some other money into that road fund before the end of the year. But you kind of have to look at both, not only the budget, how much money left do we have to spend according to the budget, but we also have to look at those fund balances in the treasurer's office to see how much money we actually have available to spend. Let's see here. If there isn't enough money in the fund, we would need to look at paying for that equipment or whatever it is out of a different fund. Maybe instead of spending it out of the road fund, we pay for it out of the tax fund. Or maybe we pay for it out of the inheritance fund. That would be an option. The other option would be to, like I said earlier, transfer money into that road fund, for example. So again, have to be looking at not only the budget, but also the fund balance. That's kind of the key point here. Timeline. So property taxes, there's a significant delay between when those property taxes are requested as part of the budget process to when those taxes actually start coming in and being paid by the taxpayers. So county fiscal year starts July 1st, and it's all the way this year until September 30th before we even adopt the budget for that year. So we already have a whole quarter of the fiscal year done and over with before we even adopt the budget. And that budget that's adopted by September 30th has an estimate of, or a property tax request to operate our county for that year. And we adopt that budget. We get everything rolled over to the treasurer's office, send out tax statements, but maybe we have a few people start paying their taxes right away in January or December, but most people aren't gonna start paying until those delinquent dates, May 1st. So fiscal year starts July 1st. Our budget is for that fiscal year, but before we even start seeing a significant portion of those taxes come in to fund that budget, that year's budget, it's gonna be almost over. It's not gonna be until April, May. That second half isn't probably even gonna be until the following fiscal year. So you can see there the taxes that you're levying this fall. So when you go to do the budget this fall in September, a significant portion of those aren't even gonna start coming into the treasurer's office until next May. So now the other thing to keep in mind is that's this year, but guess what? Next year we have the same issue. So this year we're kind of collecting some of last year's taxes, and if your property tax request stays relatively consistent from year to year, you're not going to see any big jumps. But say this fall you adopt a budget and we've got a lot of projects going on that we need to do in our county, and we're going to significantly increase our property tax request. You could do that. If you're within your levy limits and all that, you could do that. But the key thing to keep in mind is that those property taxes that you're increasing this year, you aren't going to start getting those until next year. So again, the budget is adopted. You could think, well, we got these projects in the budget we're going to start on right away. That's great. You have the budget authority, but depending on other factors, you might not actually have the money to something to keep in mind there on that timeline. Talk about that. A couple more things here on cash reserve. Some indicators that cash reserve is not sufficient. So if you have a fund in your county that is consistently running low on money, and you're having to transfer money from another fund, that would be an indication that your cash reserve is too low. If those transfers were not part of the original budget. So we'll use the road fund for an example again. Let's say originally we budgeted transfers to the road fund of $1 million. But gosh, every month we're going to have to transfer more money. Don't have enough money in the road fund. And we end up needing to transfer $2 million into the road fund. Well, originally we were saying, well, we only needed transfers of $1 million, ended up needing $2 million. That would be an indication that when you did that budget originally, you didn't have basically enough money coming into the fund. So that would be an indicator that maybe you only budgeted 100,000 cash, or maybe we need to increase that up to 500,000 to make sure we have enough money in that fund to flow low collection rates. Other option would be to reduce the amount of money being spent out of that fund. So one option would be to increase money. Other option would be to decrease the amount of money we're spending out of the fund. So maybe we don't want to change anything. Maybe we just, instead of budgeting $2 million to be spent out of the road fund, maybe we really only should be budgeting $1.7 million out of the road fund. Maybe it's a fund that operates on fees. So maybe it's a sheriff commissary fund. And the intent of that sheriff commissary fund is that the cost of commissary is covered by sales to the inmates. Well, if your sheriff's always running out of money in the commissary fund, that would probably be an indication that the fees he's charging are too low. Or maybe you want to keep the fees where they're at, and county wants to more or less subsidize the commissary fund, commissary program, and you decide that, well, we'll transfer some money if that's an option. But kind of, if you're running low on money, either need to get more money into the fund or reduce the amount of money going out of the fund. Just like your personal finances, checking accounts running low, well, better figure something out. Same thing applies here. Inheritance taxes. So I know LB 310, I'm sure everybody's sick and tired of hearing about LB 310, but it's some things to keep in mind here. From what I've heard, estimated 15% reduction in inheritance tax receipts as a result of LB 310. So if your county is one of those that heavily relies on your inheritance tax fund, just want to keep in mind that you might not have as much money to work with. So 15% probably isn't too big of a deal, probably everybody can deal with that. But just again, keep in mind that you might not have as much money in there as you were used to. Also, no guarantee that inheritance taxes are going to be around forever. So this is my personal opinion. It's not the opinion of the state auditor's office. It is not based on anything other than what I'm seeing. But personally, I don't think there's any guarantee that inheritance taxes are going to be around forever. We already had LD 310 this year with a 15% reduction. I know John Cannon is going to say over my dead body is inheritance taxes going away, but I mean, we're one of the last states, so it's something to keep in mind. How would your county respond if you don't have that inheritance tax money? So, not an issue right now necessarily, but you never know. Could be an issue in the future. Cash reserve percentages. So some financial advisors recommended 25% cash reserve. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm an accountant. I'm a budget guy, but from what I've seen, a common thing is 25% cash reserve. So that means if your county spends $10 million every year, 25% of that would be 2.5 cash reserve. So that's maybe a benchmark to think about when you're deciding how much cash reserve percentage you need. Some people say 25%. Taxing authority. So county is a creation of statute, and county government only has the authority specifically provided in the statutes. So again, like I said earlier, you're going to hear me say authority, authority, authority. Well, the reason why I say authority so much is because the county only has the authority that's given to you by the statute. So there's been, I mean, over the years, lots of court cases, and I'm not a lawyer, so don't think I am, but this is just an example of a Supreme Court case that makes it really clear that counties only have the authority that is granted by the statutes. So here's a little excerpt. The county in this state is a creation of statute and has no inherent authority. It only has such powers as are expressly conferred upon it by statute and such as are incidentally indispensable to carry into effect those expressly granted. The grant of power to the county is strictly construed, and any fair and reasonable doubt of existence of the power is resolved against the county. So that means if you are doing something in your county, you need to be able to point to a statute that gives you authority to do whatever it is you're doing. County clerk issues marriage licenses and charges a $25 fee. Well, what authority do we have? Well, there's a statute out there that says fee for marriage license is $25. If we translate that to taxing authority, if you want to levy taxes in a particular fund, you need to have authority to do that. So if you want to tax in, have a levy directly in a handy bus fund, for example, you should be able to point to a statute that says, yes, county has authority to levy taxes for handy bus. If you don't have a statute, then I would recommend against having a levy directly in that fund. My recommendation would be to levy those taxes that are needed to operate the handy bus in the general fund, and then you would budget to transfer those taxes from the general fund to the handy bus fund. So that way we don't have a risk of a taxpayer coming in and saying, well, hey, who are you to make me pay a handy bus fund levy? What authority do you have for that? Well, if you can't point to a specific statute that gives you that authority, you're opening yourself up to potential litigation, really. So that's kind of my spiel there. If you look at other governments, you'll see they have a general fund levy, they have a bond fund levy. School districts have a couple more that are expressly provided for in statute. Counties, I think, over the years have gotten a little out of control, and historically our office hasn't made too big of a deal about it. Really, one of the last things Deanna really talked about with me before she left is you really need to be working with these counties to make sure that they know that they need to have authority to tax if they want to tax in any fund other than general fund. And really the key there is is we're saying that to protect you guys from potential litigation. Basically somebody saying you don't have authority to tax for that purpose. So that's kind of where we're coming from there. Starting point to decide if you, or figure out if you do have authority or not. Our office obviously prescribes the accounting procedures for county governments, and we put out our accounting manual. And in there, if we have or aware of a specific statute citation for a particular fund, that we noted in the manual. So that could be a starting point for you. So here's an example of a statute that would provide authority for a specific tax. So here we have 2-229 that says the county board may, subject to 773442, levy such amount of taxes as may be necessary, but not to exceed the amounts actually required for county fair purposes. So if your county, you're one that has a fair board and you want to have a levy in your fair fund, you can do that. And if somebody questions you, what authority do you have? You could say, well, right here, 2-229 says the county board may levy taxes. So that's kind of what you're looking for. When I say a specific statute, we want to be able to point to a statute that specifically provides for the levy of tax. So not just a statute that says the county board is required to do something. It would need to say you're required to do something and you can have a tax for that specific purpose. If it doesn't, then my recommendation would be to do it as part of your general fund. Yeah. I am not aware of any authority to tax directly in 911 fund. I'm not saying that there isn't. There's a lot of statutes out there, and I certainly don't know everything. But if you want to tax in a 911 fund, and I go to read your budget and say, hey, what authority do you have for this 911 fund levy? You would hopefully be able to say, well, statute 123-445 or something like that. If you can't do that, again, my recommendation would be general fund and then transfer as necessary. Road fund. So a couple things to talk about here with road fund levies. So from what I've seen over the years, there's very few counties that are levying taxes directly in the road fund. So for some of you that maybe are new to the budget process, you're just continuing to do what's been done in the past of transferring from general to road. Well, the reason why you're transferring from general to road instead of having a road fund levy directly is probably at some point in the past, somebody said, hey, we don't want to share our road fund taxes with the cities and villages. So instead of having a road fund levy, we're going to levy it as part of the general fund. So statute 39-1904 says that 1/2 of road fund taxes that are collected within a city or village, that when those taxes are collected, half of them get paid out to the city and village. So for the property owners within the city, half of their taxes, half of their road fund taxes that they pay, when that comes into the county, the treasurer should be splitting off half of those taxes and paying out to the city instead of putting them into the road fund. So, but that full road fund levy, if you do a road fund levy, that all counts against your 50 cents of levy for it. So even though you aren't going to end up getting all the money because you have to share it with the cities and village, the whole thing still counts against your 50 cents. So that's something to keep in mind there. I don't see very many, if at all, road fund levies directly. So I think most of you are probably transferring in from the general fund, but that's maybe the reason why you're doing that. County funds, so general fund, road fund, inheritance fund, preservation modernization fund. No, that's what we're talking about here. All those funds that your county uses. The budget time every year might be a good time to think about reviewing the funds that your county is using and figuring out or thinking about at least, do you still need all of them? So when we go out and do our audits or we review the budgets, a lot of times we'll see counties that have funds sitting out there that have little to no activity for several years. Maybe the money's been sitting there for 20 years, nobody even knows what it's for anymore, so it just kind of sits there forever. budget time might be a good time to think about what we want to do with those funds that we really aren't using very much. So if the board would be the one that has authority over what to do with those funds. So the county board, it's decided that you don't need that fund anymore. That decision would come from the county board. And the county board, we need to take action to formally close the fund and then direct the treasurer regarding what to do with any money remaining in the fund. So that would all come from the county board. Board approval would also be required if you need to create a new county fund. So maybe you have a new grant coming into your county, or ARPA this last year, we need to create a new ARPA fund. County board has control over the funds that the county uses. So we would need direction or approval from the county board to not only close the fund, but also if we wanted to create new funds. County board would need to identify or direct the treasurer and other officials in the county. Well, number one, what the name of the new fund is. We need to give it a name. And board also needs to direct what money goes into that fund. And board also needs to direct what money comes out of that fund. So if your county is establishing a fund, besides a general fund, it would be for a specific purpose, like the road fund. The purpose of the road fund is for roads, obviously. If you're creating any other fund, it would be for a specific purpose. And county board would need to be directing everyone regarding how to use that. So key thing here is 23-106 says county board has a responsibility for managing county funds. So that's what I'm saying. County board has authority over all this is because of that statute 23-106 that outlines that's within the county board's authority or their responsibility. For those treasurers in the room, we're not talking about subdivision funds here. We're talking about county funds. So if you need to create a school fund, you have a new school bond, then you need to create a new school bond fund. That's totally different. You guys have authority over those subdivision funds. County board has control over the county funds. Just keep that in mind. We're not talking about, when we're talking about county board, we're specifically talking about county funds. Code manual. So I mentioned earlier, our office has the authority over the accounting procedures for county governments. So you want to make sure that the fund expenditure and revenue codes that your county is using are the same ones that are prescribed in our code manual. It's out there available on the website. 23-1611 is a specific statute that assigns us that responsibility. And it's for counties with a population of less than 100,000. So basically everybody other than Douglas, Lancaster, and Sarpy would fall under that provision of using our codes. No authority to be using codes that are not in the manual, and no authority to be using codes that are for a different purpose than identified in the manual. So if the manual says 2700 is the inheritance fund, we couldn't use 2700 and say it's the preservation and modernization fund. So you want to make sure that you're following those codes. If you need a new code or have a question regarding codes, talk to Rachel Whitler. She's the one that's kind of taking over that code manual. If you have a question on codes, she probably be your main contact. I can also help if she's not available. If you have other budget questions and you just want to talk to me, that's fine too. But really, either one of us, myself or Rachel Whitler, would be the two that are in charge of that code manual. And it's available on our website. So if you want the current version of the codes, on our website under local government, county information, and the county manual, there will be a manual for funds, revenue codes, expenditure codes, all that. Levy limit. So we talked about this earlier. So just again, a reiteration of what we talked about earlier. County has an overall levy limit of 50 cents. That is actually set by the Nebraska Constitution. So that's another unique thing for counties versus all the other governments, that your levy limit is set by the Constitution versus everybody else, the schools, the cities, ESUs, all those guys. Their levy limit is only set by statute. So if somebody wants to change the school district levy limit, all it takes is an LB to make its way through the legislature. But for you guys, since the county levy limit is set by the Constitution, it would take it over the people to change. So likelihood of that 50 cents changing anytime soon is pretty low for a county, but schools, I mean, this last year schools, there was a bill that didn't end up going anywhere, but there was a bill that would have changed the school district. So those guys have the possibility for more frequent changes versus you guys. Included in that 50 cents is the county budget. So the taxes or the levy that's needed to operate the county, that would be number one. And fire districts would be under the county's levy authority unless they qualify for that 10.5 cent provision I talked about earlier. Townships, ag society, historical society, and any other small local governments that don't have their own levy authority in 773442. The only option for them to levy taxes is if they get authority from the county board. Some of them could potentially get it from the city or village too, but primarily they would have to go through the county board. Determination is based on each tax district. So that 50 cents would be based on each tax district. So we would have to look at the levies that are in each specific tax district when making sure that we're within our 50 cents. So tax district 1 has the county levy, and it has fire district 1 levy, and it has cemetery district number 3 levy, and it has the ag society levy. We would have to look at that. But tax district 2 has a different fire district, it has a different cemetery district, or has a different township. So we have to be looking at each individual tax district, or really ultimately each parcel, to make sure that each property owner in the county, when we add up all those levies, the county levy, fire district, township, etc., that nobody would be paying more than 50 cents. The exception there would be if one of those other entities went to a town hall meeting or a vote. So we talked about it earlier, if the county board says 0 for townships and they go to a vote and get authority from the taxpayers, that one count against the 50 cents. That's something to remember there is where the key thing, where they're getting their authority. Are they getting it from the county, or are they getting it directly from the taxpayers? So here's a levy limit form. Those of you that work with the budget have probably seen this before. And the way it's set up is basically up top is the county levy, ag society, historical society. Basically, we know that those are county-wide levies. So everybody in the county is going to be paying those levies. So that's our kind of our starting point. And then down at the bottom is where we're going to say, we're going to put in our maximum fire district levy. And we're going to put in our maximum township levy and our maximum cemetery district levy. And if we do that, and we put in the maximum, and we're within our 50 cents, then we know regardless, there's not going to be anybody in the county that's going to pay over the 50 cent limit. Right, because we were using the maximum. At this point, we're not looking at it by tax district, we're only looking at it by maximum levy. And if we're within our authority by just taking the maximum levies, then we know by default each tax district is also going to be within the authority. But say you fill out this form and you come down and it says total possible levy is 53 cents. Well, that's over 50 cents. So, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily a problem. Because using this kind of simplified approach, we're talking maximum levies. But the next step would be to look at each individual tax districts and the specific entities in each tax district and make sure that no tax district has a levy over 50 cents. So if you do that kind of more detailed analysis and everybody's under 50 cents, great, you're good. But if you go to that next step and you're still over 50 cents, well, then you have a problem. You have to figure out what you're going to do to get under 50 cents. If you pass a resolution back in September 1st, when you gave authority to the fire districts and the ag society and townships, and their budgets are within that authority given to them, well, really the only option is to lower the county's levy. So that's where the key thing is there when we're responding to those subdivision requests in September, is to make sure that you guys are thinking about how much money or how much levy authority do we have to allocate out, which is how much do we need to keep for ourselves. Lit unrestricted funds. So this is, I'm sure, everybody's favorite topic. If this, unless the lid would go away, I would save a lot of time, because I think this is probably the most confusing thing that is part of the budget process. I think it started in 1998, and everybody's wanted to make tweaks and changes over the years, and at this point, it's pretty darn complicated. So hopefully we can get some good information out for you to understand the lid. But really the purpose of the lid is to limit the amount of restricted funds that the county can receive. So another way to think about it is how much can the county generate in property taxes or any of those other what's been labeled restricted funds. So it's not a limit on how much money the county can be spent. It's a limit on how much you can receive. So again, started in 1998. 1998 tax request became the base authority, and it's been allowed to increase every year since. As the authority, the restricted funds authority that we're talking about here does carry forward from year to year, regardless of how much you actually use. If you don't use it, you don't lose. So it's purposefully set up that way, and then you carry it forward every year, regardless of how much you actually use. So if you have authority of $1 million, you only use $750. You still get to carry forward the $1 million to next year. There's specific allowable increases to that restricted funds authority. So everybody gets a base 2.5%. You don't have to do anything. County board doesn't have to vote on it. Nothing there. Basically, everybody, regardless, gets 2.5% increase every year. If the growth in your county, according to the county assessor, is over 2.5%, you could go up to whatever that growth percentage is. So say the growth in your county was 4%. Well, in that case, what I'll say is your base increase isn't 2.5%, or 4%. So it's not 2.5 plus 4%, it would just be the 4%. So it's either everybody gets at least 2.5%, unless their growth is above 2.5%, then you go whatever that growth percentage is. County board can increase their authority each year by an additional 1%, and 75% of the county board approves that increase. So it's not 75% of the total board, it's 75% of the board that's present in voting at that meeting. If 75% votes to approve it, we can go up an extra 1%. And then we can always go to the voters. Yeah.
Goes back to your 75%. If you're 2.5, and you go up because of your evaluation increases, and let's say their example is what, 4, can you still take a 1% on top of that? Or
Yes.
take that out?
Yep. 1% regardless. So kind of look at basically each one individually as its own separate increase. So if we could go up to 4% here, we can take that 4%, and we can also come down and do the extra 1%. So regardless of, even if you go to the voters and get extra authority from the voters, you can still do the 1% regardless.
Thank you.
So here's an example. I know a common question that maybe is misunderstood is what exactly that additional 1% increase represents. And what it represents is an increase to the county's restricted funds authority. So it's not increasing the property tax request, it's just giving you the authority to increase the property tax request if you need to. So I did a little example here, and I said back in 1998, our beginning authority, our beginning restricted funds authority was $1 million. And over the past 20 plus years here, on the left-hand side is the county board that never took the extra 1%. They only took the base 2.5%. Here we are 20 plus years later, that $1 million of authority has increased to just over $1.8 million. We switch over to the middle column there, 3.5% increase. This county board decided to take the 1% every year. So over the past 22 years or whatever it is, they took that extra 1% every year. Well, their authority, they started at the same $1 million, but now 20 years later, they're at almost $2.3 million of authority. So it's an extra $474,603. So the decisions the county board makes today regarding that 1% not only affects this year's budget, but it affects every budget subsequent. So that middle column county that has $2.3 million, they have more wiggle room You know, this year prices are skyrocketing, everything's going up. The county board doesn't want to increase taxes, but if, you know, sometimes it's necessary. They would have more authority to do that than that county that only took the 2.5%. So my personal opinion is I don't know why a county board would ever not take that additional 1%. Again, we're not increasing taxes. We're only giving ourselves the authority to increase if we decide we need to. So here's the lid computation forms and the budget forms. Basically outlines what we just talked about, what that looks like on the budget forms. So you can see there we have our base 2.5%. We have our calculation of what the growth percentage is. We have whether or not the county board voted to do the additional 1%. And then if we had a voter approved increase, we come up with whatever our total percentage increase is. We take that multiplied by whatever our authority was last year to come up with our new authority. And then we're going to compare that to the restricted funds we actually have in our budget that we're going to talk about next. So what are restricted funds? So back in 1998, some smart senator, if you want to call it that, decided we're going to use the term restricted funds. And we're going to group everything listed there under the name or description of restricted funds. So biggest thing is property taxes, but we also include motor vehicle prorate, in lieu that we get from the public power districts, motor vehicle tax, sales tax, transferred surplus fees, insurance premium tax, nameplate, motor vehicle license occupation tax. So you can see there it's primarily some form of tax, but the biggest portion of it is obviously going to come from property taxes. So there, again, this is just an example of the form. It's in the budget form that you fill out. It lists out, here's what the statutes include within the definition of restricted funds. So anything that's listed there is going to be what we're applying that authority to. So common question that comes up is, county has no control over how much is received for several types of restricted funds. So if we have no control over it, why do we have to include it in restricted funds and be subject to these limits? And the answer to that is, or the idea behind that when this legislation was originally crafted was to force political subdivisions to reduce their property tax requests if they start receiving other types of money, other restricted funds. So here I have an example. Let's say the county is going to start receiving insurance premium taxes from the state of $75,000. Well, insurance premium tax is included within the definition of restricted funds. And in order to stay within our authority, everything else remaining the same, we would have to decrease our property tax request by $75,000. So if our authority remains the same, but we start getting more money over here, we have to make up for that somewhere. So therefore, property taxes has to come down. Their other option would be to increase our authority. Maybe we're going to get more money, and this year you go to voters and get more authority. That would be an option. But this is real simple example. If we had 0 unused authority, if one goes up, property taxes have to come down. That's the idea behind the lid. Because if you're getting money from these other sources, then you shouldn't need as much money in property taxes. Exceptions to the lid. So the statutes say we're going to limit how much you can generate each year in taxes. But if you are needing those taxes for specific purposes, we can put those outside the lid. Those can be an exception to the lid. So if restricted funds will be used for certain types of expenditures, those taxes can be excluded from the lid. In other words, if they're for these specific purposes we can talk about, they're not subject to the lid. So a few common exceptions to the lid would be capital improvements. So if you're generating taxes or generating restricted funds in your budget, and you're going to use those to buy land, or you're going to use those for improvements to land, those would be an exception. Put those outside the lid. It does not include equipment. So we're talking about land improvements, like we're not talking about motor graders, we're talking about computers, we're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about land or improvements. So we're gonna buy land, or we're gonna put a building on that land, or we're gonna renovate an existing building. That would be the type of things that would be a capital improvement exemption. Other one would be interlocal agreements. So if you have an interlocal agreements with other governments in the county, your portion of that interlocal agreement could be an exception to the limit. So if the county has an agreement with the city for dispatch services, and the county is required to pay the city $100,000 each year, that $100,000 that you're generating in taxes could be an exception to the limit because you're going to be using it for an interlocal agreement. It's a key thing there is another thing that we'll talk about here in a little bit, and it has to be paid for with restricted funds. So if you're going to pay for that 911 dispatch interlocal agreement using 911 surcharges that you get in, that doesn't work because those 911 surcharges aren't restricted funds. You have to be using property taxes or one of those other restricted funds for it to qualify as an exception. Last one are bonds. Taxes that we're generating to pay our bonds are outside the limit. Obviously, we need to make sure we can make our bond payment, so we don't want to place any limits on the bond taxes, although they're also outside. But the key thing there at the bottom, like I just mentioned, have to be using restricted funds to pay for those exceptions. So if you're using highway allocation to fix the road, that doesn't work. Highway allocation isn't a restricted fund, so you have to be remembering that it has to be restricted funds. Yeah.
So in the smaller general fund budgets, like treasurer or whatever, can they budget capital improvements for computers? We just can't use it for exceptions.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Yeah. So you would still code it or budget for it as a capital outlay line item. But when you're going looking at the lid, that won't qualify for it. But yeah, you would still use a capital outlay code in the budget. So here we just have in the example of the form that lists out all the exceptions that are allowed by the statutes. Consider capital improvements, bonds, interlocals, and then a few others that aren't used that are commonly used. I won't go over those, but basically whatever's listed out on the form is what the statutes allow for exceptions. Unused restricted funds authority. What does that number represent? So first thing to keep in mind is that unused restricted funds authority. That's basically the bottom number that we're looking at with the lid. And in order to be within our authority, we need to make sure that unused authority is positive. In other words, the restricted funds in our budget are less than our authority. Therefore, we have a positive unused authority, and we're in compliance with the lid. That unused number represents the amount of restricted funds that could have been included within the county's budget but weren't. So say the county fills out their budget, they come down to that unused authority number and it's $100,000. What that really means is you could have increased your property tax request by $100,000. You could have increased the amount you're budgeting to receive in sales tax or motor vehicle taxes or any of those other restricted funds. Basically the authority that you have, but you didn't use it. Key thing here is there's currently no benefit to taking exceptions that you don't need to stay within your authority. So as it stands right now, if you don't need the exception, if you're within your authority without putting any exceptions on the form, you fill out the forms and you don't put anything in there as exceptions. You don't put any capital improvement exception, and you don't put any bond exception. You don't put anything on there, and you come down to the bottom line unused authority number and it's positive. It doesn't give you any benefit to go back and add those exceptions in. You're already within your authority. So in my example, you could have a county that has their unused authority is $1 million. That does not mean that that county is in a better financial position or their budget's better than their neighboring county that has unused authority of 0. Both counties are within their authority and both are in compliance with the limit. The first county, maybe they went through and they put every exception they possibly could on that form, and they came up with unused authority of $1 million. The second county listened to what I said and said, if you don't need it, don't put it on the form, and they're at 0. That doesn't mean they don't have exceptions that they could have put on the form. They just said, well, I don't need them, so I'm not gonna put them on the form. So you just have to be careful about that unused authority comparing it to others, because you don't know what the other entities, how they did their budget.
So is your recommendation when we're filling out the exception form is to leave off those exceptions first? And then just leave it alone?
Correct. That would be my recommendation, is to, if you don't need the exceptions, don't put them on the form. It's really the key thing there is going to be the capital improvements exception that we're going to talk about next. If you put a bond exception on there or an interlocal, that really doesn't matter. It doesn't have any potential future implications. But if you put a capital improvement exception on there and you don't end up spending that, we're going to talk about that could come back to bite you next year. So we'll talk about that here next. So statutes say one of the restricted funds that's included within the definition is capital improvements that are taken but not spent have to be included as a restricted fund in the following year. So if you fill out the form and you put an exception for capital improvements of $1 million on there, and you end up only actually spending $250,000, that difference of $750 has to be included as a restricted fund the following year. So depending on where you're at with your authority, that $750, if we have to add an extra $750 in there because you didn't end up using your capital improvements, that could have big problems. It's typically not as big of a deal for counties because you guys are a little bit bigger, but I frequently see smaller local governments that get in trouble with this capital improvement exception because they take it but they don't spend it, and now all of a sudden I can't levy any property taxes this year. So again, there's no benefit to putting that capital improvement exception on there if you don't. So your budget might have capital improvements. You might have $3 million budgeted for capital improvements, but that doesn't mean you have to put it on the form as an exception. So, but once you put it on the form as an exception, you're telling the taxpayers, we're putting this outside of all these limits, and now you've obligated yourself to spend that money on capital improvements. And if you don't, you have to make up for it in the following year. So again, my recommendation, especially the capital improvements exception, if you don't need it, don't put it on the form. So another example here to maybe illustrate that a little bit. County budget is completed in the lid computation form, shows unused authority of $1 million. We go back to the lid supporting schedule and we see $750,000 capital improvement exception was taken. Well, our unused authority is $1 million, and that includes, we excluded $750,000. So if we wiped out that $750,000 exception, the unused authority would still be $250,000 within our authority. So in this example, this example county didn't need the capital improvement exception, but because they put it on the form, they've now obligated themselves to spend it on capital improvements or potentially be required to include it as a restricted fund in the following year. So, I guess moral of the story: be real careful with that capital improvement exception. It's not necessarily wrong if you put it on the form, but again, if you put it on the form, you obligate yourself. If you don't need it, my recommendation would be don't unnecessarily obligate yourself into spending that capital improvements. What qualifies for a capital improvement exception? So again, purchase of land or improvements to land. So statutes are very clear. Capital improvement is purchase of land and improvements to land. So we aren't talking about what is the definition of a capital purchase or anything like that. Maybe somebody worked at a CPA, they might have that, or I'll say it's an accounting definition of a capital purchase. We aren't talking about that here. We have to look at what the statutes define as a capital improvement. And that would be purchase of land or improvements to land. Has to be paid for restricted funds. So if you're not using restricted funds to pay for those items, doesn't qualify as an exception. So examples of an allowable capital improvement exception would be purchase of land for a new jail, and you're paying for that with property taxes. You're replacing the windows in the courthouse, paying for with property taxes. If you're putting in a new road, paying for with property taxes, all those will qualify. Things that don't qualify would be if you're purchasing land for a new jail, but really the payment of that is paid for with bond proceeds. That doesn't count. Now, the taxes you generate to pay off that bond would count under the bond exception. But if you're paying for the jail land, the bond, that doesn't count under the capital improvements exception. If you're using highway allocation to pay for a new road, or buying equipment, vehicles, office equipment, water graders, any of those equipment items also count. So you purchase of land or improvements. Budget amendments, so again, can reallocate authority within the general fund by resolution of the county board. That would not require any publication, hearing, etc. As long as the total disbursements in the fund don't change. County board can just amend the budget, or reallocate within the budget without those hearings. Looks like we're running out of time here a little bit. APA website, so after the budgets are reviewed, they all get uploaded to our website. So if you want to look at your budget or anybody else's budget, you can find them on the website. Typically, there's a little bit of a delay. Probably not going to be out there until November, December, just looking for a budget review. There will be other guidance materials on the website, like there have been tasks for the next questions, instruction manuals, all that kind of stuff. If you go out there right now, you won't see anything, because we're still working on updating all those guidance documents for all these changes as a result of LB 644. So as of right now, there's not much out there, but hopefully in the June timeframe, you'll see those guidance documents out there in addition to the new budget forms. A couple options to submit it to our office, no changes here. Can either mail a hard copy in through the mail, or you can submit an electronic PDF through the website. It also has to email it to the APA.audit's email address. For those that are through the website, you get a confirmation number. So if you're looking for a confirmation that we got it, we want to submit to the website. If you email it to us, just need a regular email, you're not going to get a confirmation. If you mail it into the post office, not going to get a confirmation. And if you call asking for a confirmation, if we got your mail the budget, I'm not going to know if we got it or not for a long time, because I got 2,400 budgets to go. So if you're looking for that confirmation, be sure to submit it online. If you don't hear from us, if you submit your budget, and never hear from us, that's a good thing. We aren't going to respond to 2,400 people and say, yep, everything looked good, great job. Just quite frankly, don't have the time or resources to do that, so we're only going to contact you if there are problems and you correct. So no news is good news. Couple things here that I want to touch on. I don't think these are in your handouts. I added these after the session was completed. So LB 807 has to do with nonprofit historical societies. So if any of you guys have nonprofit historical societies in your counties, the statute cleans up a few things, no real major changes, but it clarifies those nonprofit historical societies have two options to get tax funding. First one is they would receive allocation of levy authority from the county board, similar to all those other governments, same as Ag Society, townships, all those guys. They would get allocation of levy authority from the county board, and then they would complete and file a separate budget just like everybody else. That would be the first option. The second option would be they don't do a budget, they don't go through the budget process and don't get allocation from the county. They just get a funding request from the county. So basically the county is going to budget to give the historical society $20,000. Just a flat $20,000, here you go. Without part of the county's budget, they're going to be separate budget. If they do receive that funding request option, there are some new requirements. If they get that, they have to report back to the county board how they used that funding request. So if the county board gives them $20,000, they have to report back how that $20,000 was spent within 1 year, the earlier of 1 year, or before any future funding requests are provided. So if they come back 6 months later and want another $20,000, before the county board would give them the 20,000, they have to make a report to the county board having used it. Yeah.
Does this replace the restriction that the historical societies can only request like $5,000, or they have to send in a separate budget?
That is correct. So this bill got rid of the language that said if the county provides over $5,000 to the nonprofit historical society, that they at that point would have to be included within the county's audit and county's budget. That language is gone, and really that's a primary reason our office is the one that's trying to work to introduce this. That's a primary reason why this bill came to be, is because just from our office, what is it? I mean, you have two separate entities. You have the county and you have this nonprofit entity. How does it work to include the audit and budget of two separate entities together? Does that mean they each do their own budget and their own audit and we staple them together and now they're combined, or are they somehow incorporated within? It just really didn't make sense from an implementation standpoint, so that's gone. And it's basically replaced by this new report that they have to make to the county board. Yeah, I need it.
So do they have to do invoices or just a report? Line item?
They, I think the question was here, what exactly do they have to submit? Do they have to submit invoices or just a report? I think I have to look back at the language, exactly what it says, but I think it says, it doesn't specifically say invoices. I think it says something along the lines of a detailed accounting of how the funds were spent. So we kind of left it a little bit general. If I were on the county board, I would require invoices. I would say, I don't want this report that you could have put whatever you wanted on. I want to see the invoices. I want to see the canceled check images. I want legitimate support regarding how you spent that money, and to make sure that you actually spend it. If we gave you 20,000 last year and we only spent 5, I'm not going to give you another any more money until you spend what I already gave. So that's another piece of this report that we wanted to make sure we're getting done. Yeah.
Can you require them to provide their budgets as to what dollars they have that they receive externally?
I think you could certainly ask for it. Is there any specific provision for that in statute? Probably not. It was purposely regarding what this detailed accounting is, was a little general. I think you could probably potentially stretch it to include that. I think you probably have the county board to really detail out what exactly that looks like. Yeah,
So this legislation, it didn't have an emergency clause on it, right?
correct.
So it really won't affect this budgeting year in the following fiscal year.
It'll be 3 months from August or April 20th, so April, May, June, July 21st. Yeah, so I'll have the 3 months will be July 21st. So yeah, it would be this year. Matt, I'm taking a little bit of your time. Where is it? Oh, it's out there. Well, I'm going to take some of this time. Let's see. We'll talk about this one. It removes the language regarding including the historical society budget and audit with the county's budget and audit. It just doesn't make sense to try and combine two separate entities together. It just doesn't work. So we got rid of that. And then historical societies are already included within the list of entities that have to file an audit with the office. So no change there. A couple more LBs, LB 1165. So this LB clarifies that taxes can be levied for bonds that have been issued or authorized to be issued by the governing body or the legal voters of the local subdivision. So previously, it was our office's long-standing interpretation that in order to have a bond levy, that subdivision would need to have actually issued the bond before those taxes are levied. So if county board issues or levies the taxes in October, they would need to have that bond issued by October. That interpretation was challenged by a couple of school districts this last year, and they worked to get some legislation introduced to clarify that. And the result was it doesn't have to be issued; it only has to be authorized to be issued by either the governing body or the voters. So as long as it's authorized, you can set a bond. LB 927 introduces in a bill for LB 644. originally introduced as LE 1250, then amended on to 927. This is, again, it has to do with changes or cleanup provisions for this new LE 644 changes, so we'll talk more about that one this afternoon. Any questions, comments, concerns? Oh, all right, thank you.
Okay, let's take a